Upon my initial encounter with Thomas Jacobs, I perceived him as merely another patient, reserved, with keen eyes that bore an inscrutable burden. He arrived at the hospital for routine examinations. A tall, slender man in his late 50s, distinguished by salt and pepper hair and a courteous smile. His medical history revealed only minor health concerns, devoid of any remarkable details. I never foresaw that he would undergo a transformation. I feared for my life, or that he and his wife would ensnare me in something far more sinister than I was equipped to handle. I entered his room, adjusting my scrubs, and extended a professional greeting. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jacobs." I endeavored to suppress the persistent unease in my stomach. My heartbeat accelerated, a response I attributed to the anxiety of a new job. Although I had assisted patients before, there was an unusual intensity about him. "Is everything okay?" I inquired, observing his fidgeting on the bed. His gaze briefly met mine before averting, as if concealing something. "Yes, just a bit uneasy, I suppose," he replied, his voice low, steady yet taut, suggesting there was more left unspoken. In an attempt to alleviate the tension, I adjusted his hospital gown while striving to maintain clinical professionalism. I inadvertently witnessed more than intended when his gown shifted unexpectedly, causing my cheeks to flush with embarrassment as I averted my gaze, feigning ignorance. "Let's prepare for your examination," I managed to say, attempting to sound unaffected. However, he continued to observe me. And I discerned an unfamiliar intensity in his eyes, one that was both disconcerting and captivating. His gaze felt excessively intimate for the clinical environment, causing my hands to tremble slightly. I hastily concluded my tasks, offered a small, polite smile, and exited the room, endeavoring to dispel the disquiet that had enveloped me. The following day, while conducting my rounds, a message arrived on my work tablet requesting my assistance with Mr. Jacobs, and my heart fluttered once more. Why would he abruptly want my presence? Perhaps it was inconsequential. However, I could not dismiss the subtle voice in my mind suggesting otherwise. Upon entering his room, he welcomed me with a modest grin, more certain than previously, and said, "Thank you for coming, Emily." He spoke gently, as though we were long-time acquaintances sharing a secret. "It's my profession, Mr. Jacobs," I replied, striving to maintain a neutral tone. Our eyes met, and I sensed an unacknowledged connection. His composed and steady demeanor permeated the room, and I found myself involuntarily captivated. "You've been exceptionally kind to me." "It's uncommon," he murmured, his voice lowering to an almost conspiratorial tone. Before I could reply, the door swung open. I turned to see his wife, an impressive woman in her late 30s. With a keen vision that overlooked nothing. She scrutinized the situation, flickering between the two of us, and I felt my pulse quicken. She didn't say a word, just nodded once. Her expression tight and unreadable, before turning and leaving. Mr. Jacobs smiled, but something in his face had changed. It was like he'd been caught, but rather than looking guilty, he seemed amused. "My wife," he said simply. "A complex woman." I forced a tight smile and made an excuse to leave, my head spinning as I closed the door behind me. What was happening here? I needed to be careful. There was an energy between him and his wife that I couldn't quite decipher, something more than just marital tension. Over the next few days, Mr. Jacobs found ways to see me frequently, each interaction tinged with a charged undercurrent I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, he caught my hand as I reached for his foreline. Holding it just a little too long, his touch lingering on my skin. I pulled away, more rattled than I'd like to admit. Yet the thrill that shot through me was undeniable. This wasn't just a patient anymore. He had crossed a line, and I had allowed it. Later that week, I was in the break room, trying to sort out my tangled emotions, when his wife appeared beside me. Her presence both unexpected and intimidating. "Emily," she said, her voice carrying a cool edge. I want to speak to you. I nodded, trying to conceal my unease. And followed her to an empty hallway. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes appraising me. I know what you think you're doing, she said, her voice almost a whisper. And I'm going to warn you to stay away from him. My throat tightened as I tried to respond. Mrs. Jacobs, it's not, I don't know what you mean. I'm just his nurse. She tilted her head. A bitter smile touching her lips. Don't insult me, Emily. I see how he looks at you, and I see how you look at him. But there's something you need to understand. Tom isn't what he seems. A chill ran down my spine. Her warning felt less like jealousy and more like something sinister, something I didn't understand. Before I could question her further, she turned and walked away. Leaving me standing there, questions swirling in my mind. That evening, as I left the hospital, I saw Mr. Jacobs waiting by the entrance, leaning casually against the wall. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes lighting up with warmth. I knew I should resist. Emily, he greeted, as if he'd been waiting all day for this moment. Mr. Jacobs, I replied. My tone firm but my resolve weakening under his gaze. He stepped closer, the air between us charged. Tom, he corrected, his voice soft, coaxing. Tom. This isn't appropriate, I stammered. Trying to step back, but my feet felt glued to the spot. You don't need to be afraid of her, he said, his voice a low whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. My wife likes to control things. But she can't control how I feel about you. Every fiber in me screamed to walk away, but his words stirred something inside me, a dangerous curiosity. It was intoxicating, this attention. This flirtation cloaked in secrecy. Yet, somewhere deep down, I knew there was more to this than met the eye. Just as he reached for my hand, a cold voice cut through the air. Emily. I turned to see Mrs. Jacobs standing just behind us, her face an icy mask. She looked at me, then at her husband, and in that moment, I understood. This was a game, but I wasn't sure of the rules. Her gaze was so intense, it felt like she was seeing right through me. Without another word, I pulled my hand free and walked away, leaving the both of them standing there in the dark. The days that followed were filled with tension, whispers, and messages from Mr. Jacobs asking to see me. I avoided him as best I could, but it was no use. He found ways to pull me back in. His gaze trapping me, his voice soft and pleading. One evening, Mrs. Jacobs found me in a deserted hallway and stopped me with a hand on my arm. Emily, you need to know who he is, she said. Her voice low, her tone almost gentle. She handed me a file, her fingers cold against mine. Read this. I opened it and found photos and documents that painted a different picture of the man I thought I knew. He had a history, a past full of secrets that sent a chill through me. I looked up. Meeting her gaze. Why are you showing me this? She smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. Because I want you to understand, Emily. He's not who you think. It was then that I realized the tangled web of attraction, jealousy, and power between Mr. and Mrs. Jacobs was more complex than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about infidelity or temptation. There was a game at play here, a game of control and manipulation, and I had been pulled into it without even realizing it. As I walked away, my mind spun with questions about who Mr. Jacobs really was and what his wife gained from warning me about him. One thing was certain, I couldn't trust either of them. But the temptation to find out the truth was a fire I wasn't sure I could put out. In the days that followed, my mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. I couldn't ignore the powerful pull I felt toward Mr. Jacobs, but I was haunted by the images and documents his wife had shown me. Dark thoughts crept into my mind each time I replayed her words. I felt trapped between their hidden intentions, as though they'd both laid their own snares for me, leaving me unable to trust anyone, not even myself. A week later. My phone chimed with a notification while I was taking a rare break in the staff lounge. It was a message from the hospital receptionist, and my heart sank when I read it. Mr. Jacobs has requested you personally for this evening's appointment. The notification felt like a hook, reeling me back into their twisted intrigue between him and his wife. Though every rational part of me wanted to decline, I found myself standing outside his door that evening. Its warmth steadied my breath before going in. When I opened the door, he looked up from the bed, a calm smile on his face as if nothing unusual had ever transpired. But to Enos, Emily, he said softly, his voice soothing yet calculated. It's good to see you. I forced a polite smile, attempting to keep the conversation brief. I'm here to help with your evening check, I replied, reminding myself that this was strictly professional. He seemed to sense my guardedness. I'm sorry, he said, his tone gentle, almost apologetic. About my wife. She can be intense. She had some concerns, I said carefully. My voice wavering as I remembered the strange conversation with Mrs. Jacobs in the hallway. Concerns about, he said, a slight, knowing smile appearing on his face. She doesn't understand. He replied, his gaze not breaking from mine. What we have, this connection, is real, Emily. You know it is. You can feel it, can't you? The vulnerability in his voice unsettled me. Despite everything I'd been shown, part of me still wanted to believe him. Maybe Mrs. Jacobs was wrong. Maybe he was just lonely, trapped in an unhappy marriage with a manipulative wife. But then there was the matter of the photos, the documents, proof of something darker that I couldn't forget. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, stepping back, trying to find my own clarity. And I don't think this is appropriate, Mr. Jacobs. Tom, he corrected gently. Please, call me Tom. His gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely vulnerable. Like a man in need of saving. But just as I felt my walls starting to crumble, I remembered Mrs. Jacobs' warning, her cold smile as she'd handed me those files. The images of his past. The unsettling hints of manipulation, it all came crashing back like a wave that washed away any doubt I had. I think it's best if I ask another nurse to care for you from now on, I said. My voice resolute, though my hands shook slightly. For a second, he looked taken aback, his face hardening just a little. You don't need to be afraid of her, Emily, he said, his voice firmer now. You don't need to be afraid of me either. There was an edge to his voice that sent a chill down my spine. I'm not afraid of you, I replied, though I didn't quite believe my own words. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening. Good, he murmured, his voice a whisper that felt more like a threat than reassurance. Because I have a way of getting what I want. That night, I tossed and turned, my mind racing with fragments of every conversation I'd had with him and with his wife. They were both playing a game, that much was clear. But I didn't know who was holding the winning hand or if I'd been the prize they'd been after all along. Days passed, and I managed to avoid him. Carefully dodging his requests and swapping shifts when possible. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of him in the hallway. His eyes following me, his smile almost taunting. Every now and then, I'd feel a pair of eyes on me that weren't his. Mrs. Jacobs would appear just long enough for me to notice, her gaze cold and piercing, reminding me that she was still aware of everything. Then, one evening, as I was finishing up my last shift, I heard a voice behind me. Emily. I turned around to see Mrs. Jacobs standing in the dim light of the hallway, her expression unreadable. She looked at me, her gaze sharp as a knife. I need to show you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about Tom. I hesitated, but the urgency in her tone pulled me in. Silently, she led me down a quiet corridor. Away from the bustling hospital ward and into an empty office. She shut the door behind us, her movements calm and deliberate. "You need to know the truth," she began, her voice laced with bitterness. "About my husband. He isn't the man you think he is." My heart pounded as she handed me another file, her hand lingering a moment longer, her eyes narrowing as she looked into mine. "You're not the first, you know," she said, her voice almost pitying. "He's done this before, many times." I opened the folder, and my breath caught as I scanned the pages. They were full of emails. Printed out messages with other women, other nurses. The same words, the same charm. The same haunting look in their eyes as he played his game, winning them over and making them feel special before he discarded them. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Because," she replied, her tone cold and firm. "I don't want to lose to him. He's done this for too long, and he needs to be stopped." She leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "We can end this together, Emily. But I need you to play along just a little longer." But she nodded her gaze. "Do it, Emily, and end this once and for all." As I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, my heart thundered in my chest. I felt the weight of every choice I'd made and every line I'd crossed, and I knew that after tonight there would be no turning back. I took a deep, steady breath as I reached the door to his room. Clutching the key Mrs. Jacobs had given me like a lifeline. My mind was racing, a tangle of thoughts and emotions I couldn't seem to untangle, but this was it. The end of one way or another. I would leave this room with the true truth and finally escape their web of deceit. The room was dim and quiet except for the soft hum of the medical monitors. Mr. Jacobs lay back on the bed. His eyes closed. For a moment, I thought he might be asleep, but as I moved closer, his eyes opened, and he looked at me with that familiar gaze, both inviting and unsettling. He murmured a soft smile touching his lips. "I didn't think you'd come back tonight." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I forced myself to remember why I was here, to stick to the plan. He reached out his hand, hovering just over mine. "You seem distant," he said softly, "and I've missed you." The sincerity in his voice almost shook my resolve, but I knew what he was and what he'd done to count others. I couldn't let his charm sway me, not now. "I think we should talk," Tom said. My voice trembling as I forced the words out. "About everything." His expression changed subtly, a flicker of weariness in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, giving me that same charming smile. "Of course," he replied smoothly, gesturing for me to sit beside him. I took a seat, barely noticing the edge of the bed under me as I clutched the file. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Your wife," I began. "She told me things and showed me things about you." He stilled, his face losing some of its warmth. "My wife," he began slowly. His voice dropping as if weighing his words carefully. "My wife, you don't understand me, Emily. Know that she has her own issues. She's always trying to control everyone around her, even me." I opened the file, my hands shaking as I held up the documents and photographs Mrs. Jacobs had given me. The messages, the intimate photos with other nurses, women he charmed, manipulated. Discarded. I forced myself to look him in the eye. "These women, they thought you cared about them, like you led me to believe you cared about me." For a moment, he just stared at the photographs. His face unreadable. Then a slow, chilling smile crept over his lips. It wasn't a smile of remorse or shame. It was almost amusing. "Emily," he said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't think you're any different." The words hit me like a slap, and a shiver ran down my spine. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from mine, his eyes dark and intense. "You were so easy to manipulate," his tone dripping with derision. So willing to see the best in me, to ignore all the warning signs, just like the others. A wave of nausea swept over me as the reality of his words sank in, that he played me like he had played all the others. I felt sick, not only for believing him, but for letting myself be drawn so deeply into his twisted game. I trusted you, I whispered, feeling the weight of my own foolishness. He laughed softly, a hollow, bitter sound. As for you, Emily, you're all so eager to believe the lie, to think you're special, but you're not. He leaned back, his gaze cold and calculating. And neither is my wife. I gripped the file. Every nerve in my body screaming to leave, to run as far as I could from him, but I knew I couldn't, not yet. So what now? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. That depends, he replied. His tone smooth again. You could forget all of this, just walk away, and I won't hold it against you, or his smile twisted. You could make this harder on yourself, but I wouldn't recommend it. In that moment, I realized he wasn't only manipulating me, he was threatening me. I stood up, my legs shaky, but I refused to let him see how terrified I was. You're not going to get away with this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Your wife knows everything. She's not afraid of you anymore. His smile faltered. A brief flash of anger crossing his face. She won't do anything, he muttered, almost to himself. She's always been too weak to stand up to me. And now I have all the evidence I need to make sure she keeps her mouth shut. Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and Mrs. Jacobs stepped inside, her face a mask of steely determination. She glanced between us, her gaze settling on me with a hint of approval before turning to her husband. You're right, Tom, she said coldly. I have been too weak, but not anymore. He looked at her. A mixture of shock and anger darkening his features. What do you think you're doing? He spat, his calm facade finally cracking. I'm taking back control, she replied, her voice steady. She held up a small recorder, her finger hovering over the play button. And I have everything I need. His eyes widened, a flicker of panic flashing across his face as he realized what she'd done. She'd recorded our entire conversation, every vile word he'd said, every threat, every admission, and now she held the power. You won't get away with this, he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. But there was fear there too, fear he couldn't quite mask. Mrs. Jacobs only smiled, her expression calm and composed. You've underestimated me, Tom, just like you underestimated Emily. But I'm done playing by your rules. With that, she turned to me, her gaze softer, more vulnerable. Emily, I know I asked you to help me, and I know this hasn't been easy, but it's over now. I nodded, relief flooding through me as I realized I was finally free. I didn't need to stay in this twisted game any longer. She had everything she needed to bring him down. To put an end to his manipulation once and for all. As I walked out of that room, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of liberation I hadn't felt in weeks. I was done with Tom Jacobs. Done with the lies and the games, and I knew that no matter what came next, I'd never let anyone hold that kind of power over me again. In the following weeks, I didn't ask for it. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that Mrs. Jacobs had finally found the courage to expose the truth, and Tom had faced consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. And as for me, I found peace in moving forward, knowing I'd escaped something dangerous, something dark that had nearly consumed me. I returned to my work, my life, and the things that mattered most, stronger, wiser, and forever changed.